Good morning.
Morning.
Hi. Good to see everybody. I want to start today off a little different. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a thought experiment. Okay, work with me here. You can try closing your eyes, or you can just kind of stare off. But I want you to use your imagination. So whatever it takes to use your imagination as we go forward here, you're going to do that, okay? So I want you to imagine that you are going to sit down and draw the most incredible masterpiece of all time. Now, it's okay if you don't draw. You can draw. We're using our imaginations here, right? So you can draw, and you're about to create your magnum opus. This is going to be the best drawing you've ever created and possibly anyone's ever created, okay? And what you're going to draw is a whole world. You're going to draw a whole world on this page, and you're just going to draw until you're done. And it's going to take you a while because it's an intricate drawing. It might take you something like, 7 days, something like that, to draw this. And so it's going to have land and water and sky and creatures and plants. It's going to have everything, okay? You're drawing this. Now imagine you've been drawing for all those days straight, and you're finally done. And now you're going to sit there and stare at your drawing. What's in your drawing? Think about it. Stare at your drawing, admire it, enjoy it. It's a world, right? What's in your world? Now imagine as you're staring at it, you see movement. The creatures, they've come alive. They're interacting. They're moving. And as they're moving, they're using their little hands to eat fruit and hug each other. And you're realizing, wow, I kind of like these little guys. They're pretty cute. I enjoy them. And as you're staring at them, you eventually become so attached to them, you would like to interact with them. But how? You are this three-dimensional being who just drew something, and they're a little 2D. They can't see you. They can't perceive you. How are you going to interact with them? Well, first, maybe you try drawing some things. Imagine what you're drawing for them. You're drawing some things to give to them. And that works because they enjoy it, but it doesn't quite work the way you hoped because they don't know it came from you. So yes, successful. They enjoyed what you drew for them additionally. Not successful because there's still no relationship. So we have to move on to our next idea. Maybe next we're going to wait a while, let them get used to everything, the way their little world works. And then you're going to draw something crazy, surprising, wonderful, right? And you're going to surprise them, and they're going to be like, what is this? Who could have done this? How is this possible? And as they're searching for answers, maybe you could write a message on the wall. Think about what your message would be, introducing yourself to them. And that kind of works because now they're like, whoa, what was that? But while they'll never forget what you just did, they're still really not piecing it together. It's one message. It happened one time. They're not really getting it. Most of them are just going to kind of move on with their life because what else are they going to do? So again, back to the drawing board with how to figure out how to interact with them. Or maybe you can find one person that was a little bit more invested in what just happened. Somebody that's still searching for answers. You can find that person, and you can really invest in them. You can really introduce yourself to them. You can spend extra time rather than freaking the whole world out with more wonders. You can just interact with that person. Let them get to know you, because then that person can go around. They live in this world, right? They can go around telling everyone about you so that way you can interact with them through one person. Or maybe you even pick a small group of people. And you're like, I'll invest and I'll build a relationship with this group of people. That way they can do that. There can be more of them. They spread out and they interact with everyone. They let everyone know about who I am. Because remember, your goal is still to connect with all of the creatures. You love all of them, right? They're all very cute. Or I don't know if you're a man, they're very cool or something like that. Okay? But here's the thing. This method is working. The group and the one person in the group, that's working, but it's taking a really long time. And in the meantime, a lot of the creatures are starting to do some pretty dumb stuff. Okay? Imagine this. They found a drawing you made of a cow, and they're following that around, and they're worshiping it, and they think it knows everything. And you're like, well, it's just a drawing of a cow. Why are you doing that? And then some of them, they're using the trees to create spears, and then they're stabbing each other. You're like, wait, no. Oh, gosh, guys. And some of them are just walking right off the page. They're just disappearing. They don't even know what their reality is. Okay? But you love your little drawings so much, you are determined to save them. Okay? But the issue is, how do you save them? How do you get to them without completely destroying what you've created? Okay, you can let the thought experiment go now. We probably should end it before it becomes sacrilegious. That would be a good idea, probably. But you probably catch my drift. I am trying to get us into a mindset that helps us understand our relationship with God, or certain facets of it, a little bit better. But realistically, obviously our relationship with God is not that simple, right? And this metaphor is limited, as all metaphors are. The biggest limitation is that God is infinitely more complicated and powerful and loving, better than we could ever be, right? Another limitation is that we can't really wrap our minds around being our own creators. We can wrap our minds around being the creators of something else, but we can't wrap our minds around what it's like for God to be our creator. And the final limitation is, of course, that God knows exactly what he's doing. He has a perfect plan for helping us get to know him and have a relationship with him. He's not sitting up there trying to solve this like a puzzle like we did in our thought experiment. But I want us to understand that idea of God trying to introduce himself to us without blowing up our brains or completely disrupting the fabric of reality that we live on. He created this reality for us. He doesn't want to just blow it up and destroy it, right? And I think that's actually a big reason why a lot of the people in the Old Testament seem so confused a lot of the time, because they didn't have the Bible for the majority of the Old Testament. They didn't have any of the Bible, so they didn't really have a full grid of who God was, kind of like the little drawings on the page. I mean, we'll talk more about what kind of grid they did have and what excuses they did and didn't have, but that helps us to understand some of their decisions a little more. And speaking of the Old Testament and the people in it, we are continuing our Prophets of Old message series today. We finished up with Elijah last week. We didn't cover everything that he did in his life because there's way too much, but we covered a good portion of it, and now I think it's time we move on. We're going to cover a prophet with a little bit of a shorter story today, or should I say prophetess? Yeah. We're talking about one of my favorite stories in the whole Bible today. And it's not just because it involves a woman, trust me. It's a good story. And of course, I'm talking about the story of Deborah. Now, I'm curious, quick show of hands, how many of you have heard the story of Deborah before? Okay. All right, like about half of us, maybe a little more. I was admittedly hoping for a small show of hands because the shock value on this one's so good when you hear it for the first time. And I love sharing this story for the first time. It's a weird one. So it's pretty fun. But we're going to be finding the story of Deborah in the book of Judges, and that's the 7th book in the Bible. So it's still relatively early on in the history of Israel. And if you remember, if you were here for the Elijah series, we found the story of Elijah written in the book of 1 Kings. So basically what I'm getting at here is the story of Deborah in the book of Judges comes before the story of Elijah. In fact, Deborah died in 1067 BCE, and Elijah died in 850 BCE. And if you remember, BCE moves backwards. So the bigger numbers are older, further back. The smaller numbers are more recent, right? So what I'm saying is Deborah lived 200 years before Elijah. And I wanted to take some time to clarify this timeline because not only did we talk about Elijah first, but Deborah came first chronologically. I want to clarify that. But also because, do you remember how Elijah was basically going to war for God against the cult of Baal? Well, that was not a new problem. It turns out that was the same problem Deborah was dealing with in the time of the judges. Okay? And yes, the cult of Baal was nationalized by Ahab and Jezebel during the time of Elijah, like my dad said, but it actually first came around when the Israelites entered the promised land because it was a Canaanite religion, right? So the Israelites entered Canaan around 1300 BCE. So that's 200 years before Deborah even. And then Deborah, and then 200 years later, Elijah, and Baal was still around. So Baal was a huge problem for well over 400 years. We're looking at this timeline, right? But you know the craziest part of all of this? If the Israelites had just obeyed God, the cult of Baal would have never taken root in their culture at all. At all. Wouldn't have been a thing. See, when God finally led the Israelites into the promised land, he specifically told them, you need to eliminate the Canaanites. You need to get rid of all of the Canaanites. He could not have been clearer about this instruction. And at first, the Israelites listened. They entered as conquerors in the name of God, and they were really good at it because God was on their side. So they won, right? And that's actually where the story of Rahab is from. If you've heard of Rahab, she was actually a Canaanite woman who saved some Israel spies from being killed by other Canaanites, and then the Israelites, in turn, spared her. And the craziest part is Rahab, this Canaanite woman, then went on to become part of the lineage of Jesus. Okay? So what we see here is that God actually supported them sparing this Canaanite woman, even though he was very clear about wiping out the Canaanites. Why is that? Because God was not directing the Israelites to be merciless or brutal. That was not the point of his directions. Yes, there is nothing pretty about battle, but there was an extremely loving and good reason for his commands, as there always is. And I know that might be hard for us to wrap our heads around, but the reason, the loving reason, was that Baal worship needed to be exterminated. See, Rahab wasn't spared just because she helped out the Israelites. She was actually spared because she feared God. She wasn't loyal to Baal or to her land. She was loyal to God because she goes, oh, I'm not worried about that stuff. I'm worried about what Yahweh's doing. And because of that choice she made, she was spared and even entered into the lineage of Jesus. All of the people who, on the other hand, were loyal to Baal, however, those were the people who were fighting the Israelites when they came in. And this was the promised land. The Israelites they were supposed to be doing this, and the Canaanites were fighting them. Okay? And not only were they fighting them, they were mutilating themselves, killing children, and practicing incredibly perverse sexual rituals. Terrible stuff. Okay? God knew that if the Israelites allowed themselves to settle alongside the Canaanites, they would pick up these exact same practices. And that's exactly what happened. Baal worship took root among the nation that was supposed to be God's chosen people. It threatened God's plan for bringing his goodness and his light into the entire world. Now, I say threatened. God's never threatened, but you get the idea. This was not going to fly, okay? And the Israelites, they're supposed to be that little group of drawings that we were talking about at the beginning. They're supposed to be that group of paper people that God was using to introduce himself to the world, okay? And on top of this, top of all of that, the Israelites were terribly oppressed by the people that they failed to exterminate for hundreds of years later. And so that added an extra layer of death and destruction on top of the Baal worship. This is just bad stuff. And then this is where the judges come in, okay? And so we're finally headed towards that story of Deborah I was teasing, because Deborah was a judge. And other notable examples of judges include Gideon and Samson. And you may have heard of their stories before, but you may not be aware of the role that their office as judges played in their stories. So this will help enlighten that a little bit. Even though we're talking about Deborah, we're going to also talk about judges in general. See, like I've been saying, Israel fell into oppression because they didn't exterminate the Canaanites. And it would have been perfectly justified of God to leave them there. Okay? Not only did he give them everything they needed to not fall into oppression, but by worshiping Baal, they were terribly betraying God. It was a horrible betrayal. Can you even imagine? I mean, we can't, but God compares it to your spouse cheating on you. It's heart-wrenching. It's so hard. And the worst part is, it's Baal. Why would they rather worship Baal than the perfect Yahweh? But despite all of that justification, God did not leave them there. In fact, over and over and over again, he did not leave them there. He raised up judges, and judges were what we call charismatic leaders. So they weren't elected by the Israelites or put into office in any way that we're used to today. They were literally raised up by God for the express purpose of delivering the Israelites. Their office was declared by the Lord. And it would almost be more accurate to call them military leaders than it would be to think of them as judges, how we think of judges today. Yes, they were kind of judging between disputes of the Israelites. It's safe to assume that. And I mean, it says in Deborah's story that she does do that. So yes, that was happening. But they were only given the authority because of God's election of them, basically. People recognized God's Spirit resting on them, so they went to them. They gave them that authority, if that makes sense. Well, God gave them the authority. The Israelites acknowledged it. Enter Deborah. Okay. Now, she was a unique situation because she wasn't just a judge, she was also a prophetess, and there was only one other judge, Samuel, who was also a prophet. Okay, and there are 12 judges, so it was pretty rare for them to be both of those things. And that's why she gets to be part of this series that's called The Prophets of Old. It's not called The Judges of Old, but she gets to be part of this series because she also happens to be a prophetess. Now, see, part of the catch of the nature of the judges' leadership was that they were very normal and therefore very flawed human beings. For example, Gideon, he struggled with fear and improper worship. Samson, really bad philanderer, really bad, among other things, violent, yikes. And then you've got one judge named Jephthah, who he practiced child sacrifice. Okay, this was bad. These people were not picked for their spiritual merits, okay? We like to lump in people like Gideon and Samson with people like Noah sometimes, but there's a vast difference between those two because Noah was picked for his spiritual merits. Noah was literally the only man on earth God liked, right? These people were not picked for those same reasons. But being a prophet, on top of being a judge, is a little bit different because a prophet does require some spiritual merit. Prophets are God speaks through prophets, right? He is electing them to bring his truth, the truth, into the world. And that's part of what makes Deborah's story so fun, is that she doesn't quite fit into these boxes the same way. She's got multiple layers going on. It's very interesting. So we're going to go ahead and start reading this story. It's going to be found in Judges 4 if you would like to follow along. We're not going to read out loud every word of the story. I will summarize some of it, but we are going to be reading a lot. So I encourage you to do whatever you need to stay engaged, pay attention, because now that you have this history, I think you're going to enjoy this story. It's going to be really interesting. So here we go. Let's start reading. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, now that Ehud was dead. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in Harosheth Hagoyim. Because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years, they cried to the Lord for help. Okay, so notice here it says again. This is our first indication of the repetitive pattern that is the book of Judges. Okay, so as I've been saying, the Israelites were oppressed over and over again. This is the pattern. The oppression is the pattern. So it's the Israelites do evil. And you'll see there it says now that Ehud was dead. Ehud was the last judge. Okay, so now that Ehud's dead, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord again. Right? So that's your indication of this pattern. And it keeps happening because the Israelites refuse to repent. And repent can sound like a Christianese scary word, but again, it really just means changing your mind. The Israelites refused to change their minds. They wanted to keep doing evil. Because of that, the second part of the pattern is the Lord gives them over to an oppressor. Okay? And I know that's a little weird. We're like, oh, the Lord gives them over to an oppressor? Yes, we will talk about that more. But that's the second part of the pattern. And then the next part of the pattern, the final part, is that the Israelites call out to God for help because they are oppressed. They're like, this is terrible. God, help us. But notice there, it still doesn't say they repented. They just asked for help because they didn't like what was going on. And that's why the cycle repeats over and over again. Okay, this is not the first time this cycle happens, and it unfortunately is not the last. So even though we know that bit of a spoiler, we need to take this story as one cycle of its own, one story of its own, and enjoy it for what goes on in this story. Okay, so let's keep reading about how God uses Deborah. This is him raising up the judge, another part of the pattern. He raises up the judge. This is Deborah. Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. Okay, so here, as I've been saying, we have confirmation that Deborah was not only a prophet, but was leading and judging Israel as a whole. Really fun stuff. She was an influential person, very influential. Okay, let's keep reading what she does next. She sent for Barak, son of Abinoam from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, Yahweh, the Lord, commands you, go take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun and lead them up to Mount Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River and give them into your hands." So here we see Deborah functioning very heavily in her prophetess role, right? She's speaking the word of the Lord to Barak, and she's also prophesying the future. She's going, this is what will happen, right? Now, as we're seeing this, remember that Sisera had been oppressing Israel for 20 years at this point. So she's not going, oh, like, don't worry, you're going to go defeat this random guy. She's going, you're going to defeat the big bad guy. You're going to defeat the guy who's kept us down for 20 years. That was probably a little bit intimidating. And it may be why Barak's answer to her is, if you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I will not go. He's like, come with me. He's like, God speaks through you. You're clearly one of his favorites. You should come with me. And this is actually very telling about the position that Deborah held within Israel. Obviously, we know that she was leading, but it shows us that influence that she had. People knew that she spoke for God, so they saw her as that tangible influence of God's Spirit. And that's probably why Barak asked her to come. He's like, oh, I would love for God's Spirit to be with me, so please come as that tangible representation. And that is probably, that part of Barak's heart is probably why Deborah was so positive in her response. She goes, certainly I will go with you. But then she says, but because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. Now, I think it's kind of tempting to read this like it's the second part, like it's a punishment almost, like Deborah's going, well, because you didn't do exactly what the Lord said without any hesitation, you don't get all the honor and glory that you wanted. But I don't think that's entirely accurate. I think there's a couple of other ways we can see this. One of them being, well, if Barak wants people to come support him, he should have to share the glory, right? If he wants Deborah to go through everything he's going through, well, then he should have to share it. He's not doing it alone. Another reason might be, this is the course you're taking. Since you made this decision, well, these are the natural consequences. That's how the world works. And then there is another biggest reason why Barak couldn't have all of the honor and glory, but it hasn't been revealed quite yet, and so we'll talk about it later. So stay tuned for that one. Excuse me. But after this conversation, Barak and Deborah go gather all of Israel's forces. I'm summarizing now for you. And that in itself is a miraculous feat, by the way, okay? Because Israel was fragmented through all of Canaan. They lived all over the place, and so it was literally impossible to get them to unite without the Spirit of the Lord. And that's probably why Sisera was able to oppress them for 20 years, because they refused to just unite and stand up against him. No, but none of the little fragments were strong enough to stop Sisera on their own, right? The Israelites needed God to send Barak and Deborah to unite them. So they did just that, and then they bring the forces of Israel exactly to where God told them to. And just like God said, Sisera hears about it, gets all of his chariots and all of his men, and comes to fight the Israelites. So they see this, and they're a little intimidated. They're like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. But once again, Deborah, filled with the Spirit of the Lord, encourages them. She says, go! This is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you? So Barak went down Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. Can you guess what happens? Yeah, I'm going to summarize for you again. Yeah, they won. They destroyed Sisera's army. They killed all of them except for Sisera himself. Yeah, Sisera got away, and he goes running off to his ally Heber. He's like, ah, and somehow Barak loses track of him, okay? So he goes looking for his ally Heber, but when he does that, instead what we get is this new unexpected character and her name is Jael. Okay, Jael was the wife of Heber. Heber actually isn't in this story at all. We don't know where he is. It's just Jael. So she comes out of Heber's tent and she's like, hey, Sisera. And Sisera's like, help me. She's like, okay, come on in. She brings him into the tent. She's like, here, have something to drink. She covers him in a sheepskin and she's like, it's okay, don't worry, you can rest. I'll keep watch. And I'll even tell anyone who comes looking for you that you're not here. And then Sisera's like, oh, okay. So he falls asleep safe under her care. Let's read what she does next. But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. Okay, and this is even crazier than it sounds at first, okay? Because you have to remember, Jael is not an Israelite. She's supposed to be on Sisera's side. Okay? I mean, I don't know about you guys, but when Deborah said that God was going to deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman, I kind of thought like, hey, that would be Deborah, right? Like she's the woman in this story that God's going to... No, it wasn't Deborah. It was some random ally of Sisera. And there's really no way to explain why on earth Jael did this. Other than speculation, okay? Because she really had every reason not to do this. Not only was she supposed to be his ally, but she was betraying her family, betraying her country, and even betraying her own societal norms, okay? Women were not supposed to even show hospitality to men, let alone kill them, right? That's just not a thing. And we have no reason to know for sure. We don't know for sure that Jael was actually on the side of the Israelites. We don't know why she did this. This is all it says. It just says, then Jael killed him, right? And this is what Barak does when he finally tracks them down. Just then, Barak came by in pursuit of Sisera, and Jael went out to meet him. Come, she said, I will show you the man you are looking for. So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera with a tent peg through his temple, dead. This is so unhinged. It just makes me laugh. Barak probably showed up, decked out in his armor, covered in blood. He's got swords. He's like ready to fight. He's like, I waited till sunrise. This is going to be the showdown of the century. I finally get to fight my enemy, Sisera. Where is he? And Jael's like, oh, he's here. Come on. And she doesn't tell him. She's just like, look what I did. And Barak was probably, there's no way he could have known that was going to happen. Because again, she was his ally and she was a woman. Okay, so even though God told Barak that he would deliver, he clearly thought he was going to get Sisera because he came looking for him, right? But no, he found him dead instead. So I think it's really interesting for us to highlight the lack of clarity on Jael's intentions here, because it actually helps us focus in on the true meaning behind all of this, which is that God is good. Every time, man. Every time. Did it? I messed it up. Okay, you may hear about all this darkness in Israel's history and about that kind of gross ending with Jael, and you may feel kind of icky. You may not be like, wow, God's goodness really shines through to me in this story. Okay, fair enough. And it is challenging for most of us to hear that God told the Israelites to wipe out an entire nation. It's challenging for us to hear that God gave his beloved Israelites over into the hands of an oppressor and all of the things that came with that. But it is a reality. And as my dad always says, we cannot be afraid of the truth. So while these harsh realities are the truth, it is also true that God is good. Right? See, God only raised up the Israelites as his chosen people in order to separate himself from Baal and the evil practices, gods like Baal, that come with him. He was offering rescue to the people who didn't want those destructive practices anymore. He's basically going, follow me and I will give you a level of flourishing that you could have never imagined on your own. Of course, God wanted to stop child sacrifice. They were murdering children. Okay? I know we think of a nation and we think of all the good guys. These were not good guys. These were not good guys. Okay? Do you get upset when the bad guy who murdered a bunch of people or is trying to murder a bunch of people gets killed in a movie by the hero who's protecting a bunch of people? No, you usually don't. Unless they do some annoying, stupid anti-hero thing. I don't know, whatever. But you get my point, right? The Canaanites are the bad guys in the movie. These are the bad guys. They're child murderers. God's the hero protecting the children. Of course, it's that simple. And then to explain the oppression, right? You have to understand that this was very soon after God gave the Israelites the 10 Commandments. So yes, they didn't have a Bible, whatever. They had the 10 Commandments. And the 10 Commandments literally told them, don't worship any God but me. Don't sleep with anyone but your spouse. And don't murder people, especially children. And the Israelites went, nah, I think I'd rather kill my children. What the heck? Okay, and fine, before the Ten Commandments, God delivered the Israelites from Egypt in the most miraculous way the world has ever seen. And then he proceeded to follow through on every single promise he made to them. Okay? Fine, the Israelites were struggling to have a grid. They knew God. They had reasons to know God. Maybe they forgot. But God was not leaving them floating, stranded. And that is why God had to give the Israelites over to oppressors. They weren't learning. They were not learning. There was no way to get it through their thick skulls. And God had to take drastic measures to stop terrible things from happening. God needed child sacrifice to stop by whatever means possible. And what's really crazy is that the very qualities about God that caused the Israelites to want to worship other gods are the qualities of Yahweh that caused him to save the Israelites. I'll repeat that again, and then I will explain it. Okay? The very qualities about God that caused the Israelites to want to worship false gods are the qualities of God that caused him to save them, despite all of their terrible nonsense. See, up until the 10 Commandments, the Israelites they'd never heard of the concept of monotheism. Okay? I mean, maybe at best they were worshiping God as like the king God, but they were still worshiping all of the pagan gods. They didn't know that monotheism could be a thing. So worshiping God exclusively was still a relatively new concept by the time of Deborah. And I give them that because even nowadays, when you introduce a new concept to a group of people, it takes them a long time to comprehend it, let alone put it into practice. But here's the catch about every single pagan god compared to our God, and this is what I was talking about with the qualities of God versus qualities of false gods. Okay? Our God is perfect, all-powerful, all-knowing. He is the truth, and he is loving. So those are the qualities that caused God to save the Israelites despite their trashiness, because human trashiness, human terrible sinfulness does not impact God's perfection. So even though he could be justified in leaving people to rot, he's too perfect and he's too loving. Okay? But the Israelites didn't want an unchanging, perfect God. They wanted a God they could manipulate. And these pagan gods, I mean, not real, but in what they were taught, they could manipulate the pagan gods because the pagan gods were dependent on certain human practices for certain outcomes. So basically, you could blackmail these gods. And that was a huge reason the Israelites wanted to worship them. And that's the ugly truth about human nature, right? We only like power when it gets us what we want. You love your parents' authority when it allows them to pay for everything for you and feed you and clothe you. But you don't like it when it allows them to tell you to not go in the street with the older kids or that you have to go to a nap when you would rather stay up. And not much changes when you get older. You love a God that protects you and provides for you, but you don't like it when he doesn't do things the way you would. And see, jail is actually a perfect example of this. And we talked about God being the God of unexpected when we were talking about the unexpected when we were talking about Elijah. And Jael is the unexpected. She's even an undesirable candidate for taking down Sisera. But Sisera went down. The Israelites triumphed. And that was what mattered, not the way it happened. This is the last couple of verses of Judges 4. On that day, God subdued Jabin, king of Canaan, before the Israelites. And the hand of the Israelites pressed harder and harder against Jabin, king of Canaan, until they destroyed him. So that day, meaning the day that Barak found Sisera in Jael's tent. So to see, despite all of the craziness of this story, things still went down exactly the way God said they would. And it was in favor of Israel. And even Jael's victory over Sisera was a sign to Barak of God's sovereignty. And that's that biggest reason why Barak couldn't have all of the honor and glory that I was hinting at, right? Barak could not think. He should not think that it was because of his greatness or his actions that Israel triumphed. It was because of God's greatness. And we all needed to know that. We needed to see that in this Bible story recorded thousands of years later. And why is that so important for us to understand? Because God is good. So good. And we need to follow God for our own benefit. Remember, the Bible is God's autobiography, more or less, and the Old Testament is the story of God trying to introduce himself to humans without blowing our brains up, like the paper people. So the story of Deborah, because it's in the Old Testament, teaches us some very basic characteristics of God's nature that we tend to forget. Namely, that he is all-powerful and that he is all good. Okay? And we like to forget that God is all-powerful or even fight against the fact that God is all-powerful because we forget that he's all good, right? So we think that, no, I don't want an all-powerful God because I want a manipulatable God. Or I don't want an all-powerful God because, well, he must be selfish and fickle and hateful like I am. But when we give up needing to compare God to ourselves, when we just really accept this reality that God is all-powerful and he's all good, when we just believe that with faith and walk forward in it, that's when we get access to the best things in life. Do you want to have power? Do you want to be smart and knowledgeable? Do you want to enjoy your life and get everything you could have ever wanted? Be humble. Die to yourself. It's not, I know it sounds opposite, it's not. Because it's just interacting with the reality that we live in. Okay? If you accept your reality, you may end up prophesying like Deborah, or leading an army to victory like Barak, or being used in and despite your flaws like Jael for something amazing. Some of us like to fantasize about what it would be like to have no authority in our lives. If we were the only person we had to answer to, then we could get everything we wanted. And we think that the only thing stopping that from happening is oppressors, right? We think, well, there's the oppressors and there's the oppressed, and I'm the oppressed, but I'm also need to be an oppressor. We just imagine that it's all like that. But maybe you imagine your oppressor is your parents or your boss. Maybe your oppressor is your spouse or your government. Maybe you think God is the only thing standing between you and the life you really want. But when you fantasize about this, you are fantasizing about walking off the edge of the page you were drawn on. That's not reality. Reality has authority. Reality has God. And that's a good thing. What would have happened to the Israelites if there was no authority and no humility? Well, yeah, we don't have to speculate. We know what happened. They were subjugated to a terrible authority anyway. They thought they could do things their way. Heck no, now you're going to do things a much worse way. And that's not just God punishing people for the sake of making himself feel good. It's God punishing people because everything but God is a terrible God. We as humans are designed to worship something. We will have a God. Every God but Yahweh, not good. And making yourself your own God, some of the worst gods of all. That's the reality we live in. We have to face it. If we don't, we destroy ourselves. We like to look around at all the evil in the world and blame God because that's when we decide to remember that he's all powerful. We're like, oh, look at all this evil. God, you did this. But we're forgetting the second part of his characteristics that we learned today, that he's all good. When you forget either of those facts, it's no better than forgetting your own face right after looking at it in the mirror. You're forgetting your reality. So think back to our drawing analogy at the beginning of today. But instead of imagining yourself as the drawer, I want you to imagine yourself as a drawing. Stop getting caught up in all the minor things that exist in our few dimensions that we perceive. Focus instead on the much greater, much more powerful, much better reality that is God and the work he is doing in your life personally and in the world around you. You're just a drawing on the page. It's good to understand your page and interact with it, but God is the bigger reality. He is what matters. And when you acknowledge that, that is how you avoid the things you think you want that are actually just really destructive and bad for you, like Baal worship. And that is how you get the things that we as humans aren't smart enough to realize we want the most because they are what's best for us. That's the secret. Let's close in prayer. God, I thank you that we do have access to your word. I thank you that you never gave up in your efforts to interact with us, to reveal yourself to us, because you are so perfect. We are eternally grateful for access to you. Let us become obsessed with you. Let us learn what it is to truly love you and to know you and to pursue you. I pray that you would continue to speak through this crazy story of Deborah throughout the week for the rest of our lives. Let it ring in our minds that you are all powerful and all good. Let us not walk away unchanged. Have your way. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, let's go enjoy some of that yummy smelling food. Yay!